Between 1956 and 1959, rock and roll seemed invincible, but it was an illusion that didn't last long. In a span of just 3 years, the stage was forcibly emptied. The protagonists were removed from the scene, one by one, in the most brutal way possible. Starting with the first, Bill Haley.
Now when the clock strikes 12, we'll cool off and start rocking around the clock again.
Bill Haley releases Rock Around the Clock. The song is featured in the soundtrack of Blackboard Jungle and becomes the trigger for the first recorded riots in London and New York cinemas. Seats are ripped out, screens are torn, and the British press demands the film's immediate ban. The paradox is that Haley is 30 years old and wears a plaid suit. He sold millions of copies because he was the first to arrive, but was quickly discarded.
11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, rock, we're gonna rock around the clock.
He was the soundtrack to a rebellion that didn't live up to expectations. The industry realized that rock generated rivers of money, but selling rebellion with the face of a family man had an expiration date. To profit from teenage fury, record labels needed a face that was, in fact, dangerous. And the southern United States was about to deliver the perfect product. Elvis sings Hound Dog on The Milton Berle Show, abandons his guitar, and starts rubbing the microphone stand against his groin. The reaction is immediate. The press calls him vulgar, the church condemns him, and television begins to control how he can be shown in future performances. The song stays at #1 for 11 weeks and sells millions of copies because Elvis packages the visual aggression of black clubs onto a marketable white face. But the cost is living under constant surveillance and public pressure not to cross the line into obscenity. Was Elvis a genius or just the pretty face the system needed? What do you think? While Elvis was making millions selling a sanitized version of rhythm and blues that white radio stations accepted, the original creator of this aggressive aesthetic decided to record something so hysterical, fast, and dirty that no white artist could reproduce it on national TV. Little Richard recorded Tutti Frutti. On stage, he disregarded traditional technique and pounded the piano as if it were a drum, eliciting a violent sound that record labels had never heard before. Black and queer in a completely segregated circuit, the record label forced him to alter the original lyrics, which explicitly discussed sex, to avoid censorship and boycotts from white radio stations. He set the vocal standard for rock and sold millions of records, but the psychological toll destroyed him. Raised in the church, Richard suffered a moral crisis at the height of his fame, and during a tour, convinced that rock was an offense to God, he abandoned his career and threw his jewelry, including a diamond ring, out of an airplane window. Would you have the courage to abandon your peak for a belief, or was Richard too radical? With Little Richard fleeing to the church, the piano bench remained empty. The market lost its most extreme figure. But in Louisiana, a young white man saw an opportunity to take that exact aggression, remove the religious guilt, and replace it with pure arrogance. Jerry Lee Lewis records Great Balls of Fire. He plays by kicking the bench and hammering the keys, sometimes using his feet on the piano. He sells over 1 million copies in a few days and becomes Elvis's only real rival. But his career is cut short in May 1958, when the press discovers that his wife is Myra Gale Brown, his 13-year-old cousin. The tour is quickly canceled, and his fee plummets from around $10,000 to much lower amounts for smaller performances. Do you think the 1958 cancellation was fair or excessive? Jerry Lee imploded his own empire. With him outlawed, Richard in the church, and Elvis in the army, rock was losing its chaotic frontmen. The genre needed to survive without relying on scandals, focusing strictly on technique and songwriting. Chuck Berry laid the foundations for rock's DNA in Johnny B. Good. He created the opening riff and lyrical narrative that would shape the following decades. The song became a top 10 hit, but Berry was a black man buying property in white neighborhoods of St. Louis, something seen as unacceptable in segregated America. In 1959, the system found a loophole. He was arrested under the Mann Act and later sentenced to prison. While white kids got rich studying his riffs, the true architect of the genre spent some of his best years locked up in a federal prison. Was Chuck Berry's arrest justice or a plot to remove a black businessman from the top of the charts? Do you agree? But in Texas, a young man with glasses understood the lesson. Rock didn't need hysteria. It needed studio engineering and production control to avoid depending on the old rules of the industry. Buddy Holly plays Peggy Sue on TV. He records using overdubs and composes his own material, setting the standard the Beatles would follow. The song reaches the top 3 in the United States, but artistic independence clashes with the reality of touring. To avoid sleeping in broken-down buses in sub-zero temperatures, he rents a plane that crashes in Iowa. It wasn't a curse. It was a logistical failure by promoters exploiting musicians in precarious conditions. If the plane hadn't crashed, would Buddy Holly have prevented the British invasion? Or would he have been the mentor of the Beatles themselves? I want to know what you think. The plane crash didn't just destroy the minds behind the music. On the same plane was the most brutal example of how the industry operated. An inexperienced boy who barely had time to understand the contracts he signed. Ritchie Valens records, "Ooh, my head." At 17, he's pulled out of high school by a record label and thrown into a winter tour with no control over his own money. He's the first Chicano rock idol and wins his seat on Buddy Holly's plane with a coin toss. His death is the result of a teenager trusting executives who are cutting costs on security. He dies before turning 18, leaving behind only a few hits. Was Richie Valens an unfulfilled legend, or just a kid used as cannon fodder by greedy businessmen? Leave your comment. In just a few years, rock and roll went from a wild revolution to a domesticated product. Elvis was forced into military service, Richard silenced by faith, Berry imprisoned by the system, and Holly wiped out by a plane crash. But I want to know from you, which of these massacres was the cruelest in the history of music? Did rock really die in 1959? Or was it just waiting for the moment to cross the ocean and come back stronger? If you liked this video, subscribe to the channel and leave a like.